Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing the latest questionable and possibly illegal actions taken in the saga of a police use of force database. Spokane's mayor asking to make a temporary tax permanent weeks after telling voters to trust her tax proposal as temporary. Seattle hitting the brakes on a capital gains tax there, and Washington's builders pushing the state to obey the will of the voters who said they have no appetite for natural gas bans. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Washington State University signed a $5 million contract earlier this year with a contractor. Seems mundane, right? Well, until you learn that the company is currently under investigation by the FBI for price fixing and overbilling government contracts. Now, questions are coming up as to whether the school stepped outside of the law to close the deal. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell spoke to his old friend about the matter. TJ, give us a little backstory first.
Yeah, so this whole thing concerns a police use of force database project that the Attorney General's office is heading up, and they gave the contract to build it to Washington State University a couple of years ago. And so Washington State University has struggled to find a subcontractor to actually do some of the technical stuff like cloud services. So they were originally going to go with IBM, but IBM backed out of the contract negotiations because of stipulations regarding intellectual property being forced to hand that over to the university. So they're going with this company called Carahsoft, and it is a Virginia-based company, and the contract amount was roughly $5 million to have them work on this. So as you mentioned, they were just raided by the FBI in September.
Yeah, and this is not just a little investigation. It's not an inquiry. This is people with acronyms on the back of their rain jackets, walking out with computers in boxes at this point. So it's pretty serious, right?
Yeah, and this is not for people who want to keep track. This is not the only investigation that's going on, and it's not the first one that's going on. They're being investigated for violating another federal law. It's the False Claims Act. And they were overbilling several federal agencies. In 2015, they paid $75.5 million in fines for violating that same law. So this has been a recurring theme with this company, which has tons of contracts at the federal level.
And now you also got a hold of some documents from I believe your old friend Bob Scales, who has been involved with this and was a contender and then not, and then filed ethics complaints, where it was the university or the Attorney General's office had somebody who higher up, an official, say, "Hold on, why are we approving this now for a product that we don't have access to? Isn't that illegal?"
Right. Under under state law, it is illegal to give advance payments or prepayments for services that haven't been rendered. There are some exceptions. However, it's difficult to see how that would apply to the kind of services that they're offering. This isn't like a license agreement. This is actual services. And so the budget director for the Attorney General's office was given the contract because the money's going through them. Mm-hmm. And he's looking at this and he's saying, I just want to make sure that this is what I think it is. This is a basically user agreement or a license fee for a system that's not built and that we don't have access to. And if that is what it is, this is a prepayment. So he's very politely saying, and then he ends the email with, I hope I'm misreading the agreement. The reason he's saying that is because he's saying, I hope I'm not reading this to say this is a violation of state law.
Yeah, that's very, very corporate ease in terms of diplomacy to say, are you guys seriously considering doing this? And here's the law that you would be breaking if you are going to go forward with it. And that's essentially also what Scales was saying about this prepayment anyway, correct?
Actually, according to Scales, he didn't know about this state law until he read that email. So the budget director for the Attorney General's office is calling out this thing as being in violation of state law, in his own very indirect way of saying, hey, we might need to relook at this. For someone who's reading this email, it's not difficult to see the point he's making, because if this wasn't running afoul of state law, he wouldn't express the kind of concerns that he's saying.
Right. Well, and you want people like that inside of the Attorney General's office and people that have the knowledge of state statute to raise that red flag. But did he raise it too late? Is the contract already finalized?
He raised it when the contract was sent over to him. I think that this was because no payment had been made at that point. The contract might have been, I think it was signed in late June, and he was expressing these concerns in early June when he saw a copy of the contract that was sent to him, but no payment had been made at that point. And the fact that they're moving forward means that payment has probably already been made. And so, and for the record, I reached out to the Washington State University, and I reached out to the Attorney General's office. They've not denied that payment has been made. They didn't argue that this was not in violation of state law. Washington State University did not weigh in at all. They made issued no comment. They didn't respond to my email. The Attorney General's office didn't deny that this was potentially running afoul of state law.
Now, see, they seem to more attack the messenger, in that being Mr. Scales, in their response, claiming that this is just him continuing to retaliate for not being selected for this police use of force database, to which he was the obvious choice, with the exception that he did not want to hand over his intellectual property to the university either, right?
Right, which is funny because he's also accused them of stealing that intellectual property to use for their database. So that not sure where that complaint has gone so far. It's but yeah, it's interesting the response that they gave by saying that the underlying agreement was a grant, not a contract. But the problem with that is if that didn't apply to state law, or this was not applicable, if this was not at risk of violating this state statute, why would the budget director express concern?
Right. And if the budget director's concerns were allayed immediately to say, no, this is a grant, this isn't that situation, why would that not have been the quick response from the state to you to say, listen, was just a misunderstanding, everything's straightened out, everyth's on the up and up, and yet you get a non-response, essentially attacking the people who brought up the concern in the first place.
Yeah, they said that the budget director asked a question before the contract was reviewed. He wasn't asking a question. He was saying, I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. And so when I asked whether it was if his interpretation of what he was reading was correct, they denied it was an interpretation. But they said it was a question. It wasn't a question. He was saying, this is what I'm reading. And I asked the Attorney General's office, do you agree with what he wrote? That this was a prepayment, or that the way that the contract was written, where they're getting an advance payment for services they haven't provided, represents a prepayment. They didn't respond to that. So if it wasn't in violation of state law, they would have come out and said so overtly.
Right.
The fact
it depends on what your definition of is for the most part in this situation. All right. Thank you, TJ. Spokane currently has a tax on utilities that is set to expire at the end of the year. With a budget deficit due to much overspending due to COVID funding reliance on the horizon, the mayor's office wants the city council to get rid of the sunset provision and keep taxing ratepayers into 2025 and potentially beyond. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser covered news of the push to keep the tax. Tim, was there any explanation given beyond we need money?
No, Cole, there wasn't much information provided other than that it would impact the city's general fund. Now, former Mayor Nadine Woodward proposed this temporary 1% increase to the city's already existing 20% utility tax around this time last year to solve her own budget deficit. Spokane has been using stopgap measures like this to make up for expenditures outpacing revenues each year. Now, the new mayor, Lisa Brown, is facing a similar issue since she took office earlier this year. Now, the deficit is still there year to year, but she doesn't want to fill it with stopgap measures like Woodward has done in the past. So she's been on a cutting spree to make ends meet. But it looks like she still is going to need to use this 1% temporary increase to make ends meet the next 2 years.
Yeah. And to Mayor Brown's credit, it does appear that she is really taking the cleaver. I mean, I don't have the context in terms of the entire budget, but it does appear that she's looking in earnest to limit the size of government in Spokane. But there is an issue with her asking for this sunset to be removed because the conversation of sunsets came up in another tax issue that she originally proposed, correct?
Yeah, there is another recently passed tax with the sunset, but like we're seeing with this utility tax increase, a sunset can only mean so much. Voters recently passed Mayor Brown's proposed community safety sales tax, which collects about $1 for every $1,000 spent, but that was with the promise to end collection after about 10 years. Now, that sunset clause, like I mentioned, is legally binding, but in different ways than if it had appeared on the ballot measure itself. Now, since the city council passed its sunset clause after sending the measure to the elections office, the measure isn't technically tied to it by, say, the voters' decision. This means that at any time, the city council could, by majority vote, remove the mayor's assurance with this sunset clause that it would stop collecting after 10 years, which is exactly what she's trying to do now with the former mayor's sunset. So a few weeks ago, Lisa Brown told voters, look, trust me, after 10 years, we're going to stop collecting. That's why we put the sunset on it. Then 2 weeks or so after her tax passes, she says, hey, let's remove this other sunset, even though I said we wouldn't do that with the one we just passed.
She's starting to sound like the Python from the Jungle Book. Trust me. Now, I believe that there were a couple voices that did speak up about the irony of the situation in requesting to get rid of a sunset only a couple weeks after having no sunset, no ironclad sunset in a ballot proposal of her own, correct?
Yeah, council members Cathcart and Bingle had been kind of warning about this for weeks and months leading up to the election. So just weeks after the elections passed, now that they're trying to do this with a separate tax, Cathcart had something to say about it when they brought it up in committee. He wasn't happy. When they brought up this temporary increase last year to close that deficit, he asked over and over again, look, is this going to be a one-year thing? Is there a chance that it's going to be made permanent? And they told him, trust our insurances. And now here they are doing the same thing. So it kind of just proves this point that he's been trying to make the last few months that, look, these sunset clauses mean nothing if we don't put them on the ballot measure themselves. Otherwise, you're just leaving it up to the city council to potentially put their say over the will of the voters.
Go back on their word. But I mean, and Brown did respond to that, though, as saying, listen, you guys, and I don't know how much stock I put into this, but said, you guys are the ones that elect the city council. That's the check on whether or not these taxes go away.
Yeah. About a month before the election, Mayor Brown and Councilmember Bingle had a debate over the tax, and he brought up a lot of these issues. And Mayor Brown's response was essentially, hey, look, the biggest assurance of all is that you guys get to elect new council members every other year that have the ultimate say over this, and you ultimately get to say if it passes to begin with in the first place. Now, I mean, she's being honest there, but she was kind of relying on the fact that the council members wouldn't repeal this. And she asked them to do the very same thing just weeks later with another tax.
Right. Well, and then also, leaving out the fact that if these city council members do decide to vote to get rid of the tax, then they're going to see flyers in the next election cycle saying they voted to decrease services for police, fire, anything that helps babies and the like. So I mean, and making them make that political decision as well when you're looking to get rid of revenue, even though they promise to do that. So there is a political calculus to that play as well. Thank you, Tim. After Washington voters didn't repeal a state capital gains tax, the city of Seattle decided they want in on that action. But as Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly reported this week, council members appear to have gotten cold feet on the measure. Spencer, what's the latest vote on this proposition?
The latest vote on the proposed capital gains tax is a 4-4 vote with one abstention. This means that the bill did not get a recommendation from the Select Budget Committee and is unlikely to be passed. And now, for one note, the one abstention comes from Councilmember Tanya Wu, who had to abstain her vote because her husband sells or trades stocks. So that's why she could not vote on this legislation.
Interesting. Now, give us a quick recap of what this would be and how it differs from the state's capital gains tax.
Sure. So this tax would impose a local 2% capital gains excise tax, and that's applicable to non-retirement financial gains over $250,000. Now, there are some exceptions, including real estate sales. Now, this is very similar to the state's 7% capital gains tax, but that this goes within the Seattle jurisdiction. So the only people that you will see subject to this are some of Seattle's wealthiest residents. About 816, I think, was the last number I saw that paid the state capital gains tax. So you could probably see that number. If this were to pass, that'd be the number you'd see for how many people would pay.
So there's real-time data as to who exactly would pay it and how much they would pay if all of them did agree to, subject themselves to this tax, which they have admitted is increasingly volatile because you could influence behavior of people who have the financial means to do something about it. And that goes back to what the city employed economists did have a pretty dire warning about.
Yeah. There was a very interesting the memorandum from the Seattle Office of Economic Forecast. They said, this tax will you see a huge exodus of wealthy people because there's a giant loophole. And we've talked about this before, Cole. Basically, this tax is subject to people whose permanent residence relies in Seattle. So if you see any of the wealthiest people just somehow change their permanent residence to one of their other homes outside the city, they are the tax altogether. Now, this is something that was noted by Seattle City Councilmember Kathy Moore, who proposed this tax. And what she basically said is she received a bunch of emails from these people who were subject to the tax saying, you're going to push me out of the city if this passes. And she said to all of you, wow, this is not a tax on your income. This is a tax on the sales of capital gain assets over $250,000. I don't know if that would do much to persuade residents to say it's okay then. But it obviously wasn't enough for 4 other council members who voted against this. There was one council member, Rob Sacco, who I quoted, he said, this is a good tax at a bad time, basically. And then Seattle City Council Chair Sarah Nelson also pointed out the fact that these residents bring a lot of economic value into the city. And so if you remove them from there, you're going to see even more issues with revenue from other streams within the city.
And now with that 4-4 vote with the one abstention, it's how does city government work in that regard? Is this technically not dead? Because this isn't, the bill dies because it could not get out of committee as we see at state level legislatures, correct?
Yeah, this was a lesson learned for me as well with how city government works. So basically, because this comes from the Select Budget Committee, this is a special committee and it's full of all the city council members. So whatever is passed is just given a recommendation. So while this bill did not technically receive enough votes to go on to get support, it still is going to be set for one final vote. Now, if one of those 4 council members has a change of heart, that could change, this tax, but it's unlikely, I can say confidently.
All right. Well, thank you, Spencer, for giving yourself a quick civics lesson in municipal law out there in Seattle. We always keep learning. And after voters approved of a ballot initiative shutting down any efforts to ban the use of natural gas in Washington, all eyes looked to state officials to see how they'd react to a major environmental initiative being shut down. Rumors of legal challenges are also floating around Olympia around the natural gas ban. Capitol correspondent Carleen Johnson spoke to the Building Industry Association of Washington. Carleen, what are they asking for?
Well, they're basically pointing out that December 5th is just 2 weeks away, and that's when the voter-approved initiative 2066 takes effect. So that's the only initiative that was approved by voters from the November 5th ballot, and it protects natural gas as an energy choice. So Building Industry Association of Washington, they're the ones who backed 2066. They're saying, hey, State Building Code Council, knock, 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 you need to take immediate action to bring the code into compliance, because as of right now, 2066 and parts of the 2021 Washington Energy Code, which is what we have now, are not congruent. So they're saying you got 2 weeks or less now to fix this and you're doing nothing. What's the deal?
Right. So December 5th is the deadline for this. And what we've seen from the state, even before this was passed, was they appeared to treat this in a similar disposition as they did with the one initiative that was allowed to be passed by the legislature regarding the education and the parents' rights in terms of education. They just simply said, well, I mean, there really doesn't change anything, does it now?
Yeah. The Parents' Rights Bill 2081 that was adopted by lawmakers, right? Then you had the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction give guidance to all 295 school districts in Washington, say, hey, you know what? This was passed and parents might have these rights under this state deal, but we believe there's some conflict with federal protections for privacy rights for students. So just go ahead and ignore it. So we'll see if this one kind of goes the same way, but as BIAW sees it, and as the initiative was written, they don't have to change the complete 2021 state energy code. There's lots of it that isn't going to be touched by 2066, but the parts in the 2021 code that disincentivize and discourage new development and remodeling of homes, changing out appliances from natural gas to electric, they're saying that part's got to change, because 2066, that's what it did. It very specifically said, you can no longer disincentivize and discourage natural gas as an energy choice in new construction and in remodeling. So
now, you said before, Carleen, you think that there's going to be a couple different, probably after December 5th, a couple different legal challenges. One, a potential legal challenges from people, opponents of the bill, trying to disqualify it, but also from people like BIAW saying, look, they're not doing anything about it and they're defying the will of the voters. So you could see two different sets of lawsuits trying to fight this in the court system.
And I think even long before the November 5th election, you had both sides, discussing this and preparing. Now, one of the groups that's talked about a legal challenge, and they were open about this the day after the election when it was likely the 2066 was going to pass, you had a group called Climate Solutions, and they contend that the initiative 2066 violates the single subject requirement in the state constitution. Right. Initiative can only deal with one thing, so voters don't get confused. And they say that it not only requires that 2066 not only requires utilities and governments to provide natural gas, but also repeals and amends some of the regulations that are currently in place. So they contend, the opponents of the measure contend, that that is a violation of the single subject rule. But backers of the initiative are fully confident that they had tons of legal advice on this well before the measure was even crafted, saying they are certain it will survive a legal challenge. And they say it's absolutely a single subject for consumer energy choice. So, but you're right. If the Building Code Council does nothing by December 5, when this initiative takes effect by state law, You're going to see BIAW and maybe even Let's Go Washington, which also backed the measure, get on board for a challenge of their own for the fact that, the initiative isn't being, complied to by state agencies.
Now, you reached out to the state, and did they give you pretty much that response, or did they, kind of hedge their bets a little bit?
Yeah, it was interesting because I spoke to, or via email, had correspondence with a woman by the name of Jennifer Reynolds. She's with the State Department of Enterprise Services, and the State Building Code Council kind of falls under their jurisdiction. So they've been very responsive as this thing is before the election and since. But their contention now is, okay, we do this rulemaking to update building codes every 3 years to align with national model codes, and assure that we're complying with, legislative rules as to how these energy policies are drafted. So they're saying we're going to wait until the next update period to make sure that we're in compliance with 2066. You can imagine that's not going over well with BIAW. They're like,
and see you in 3 years is not what voters probably voted for when earlier this month when they decided that they didn't like a ban on natural gas in the state.
Yep.
Thank you, Carlene, and a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.